My name is Renee Say. I am 27 years old, and I am the only daughter of Charles Say, one of the most powerful real estate moguls in New York. To the world, my last name means wealth, skyscrapers, and influence. To me, it has always meant control, fear, and the constant feeling that nothing I did was ever good enough. The night my father abandoned me in the middle of a deserted road, rain pouring down like the sky itself had turned against me, I understood just how far he was willing to go to break me. He stripped me of my phone, my wallet, even the jacket on my shoulders, and told me to walk 12 miles home alone. He called it a lesson. But what he didn't know was that someone else had been watching, someone who would make sure this was the last lesson he would ever teach me that way. That night was supposed to be the moment I finally shattered under his control. Instead, it became the beginning of the fight for my life, my freedom, and everything he thought he could keep from me. If you've ever looked into the eyes of someone you love and realized they only saw you as a disappointment, then you'll understand a little bit of what I've lived through. Before I share the rest, I'd be so grateful if you could like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Knowing that you're here listening makes me feel less alone in a story that once nearly broke me. This isn't just about growing up rich in New York or having a last name people recognized. It's about what happens when the person you trust most decides control is more important than love. My father thought abandoning me in the rain would teach me obedience, but what it really did was open my eyes. That night, soaked to the bone and standing on a dark road, I realized the truth. My family's empire was built not only on money, but on secrets and fear. And in trying to break me, my father had unknowingly set me on the path to uncover everything he wanted to keep hidden. So let me take you back to where it began. Not in the storm, but in the house I grew up in. A mansion that sparkled like paradise on the outside. But for me, it was nothing more than a beautiful cage. I grew up in a mansion that most people would have called a dream. Marble floors gleamed like mirrors, chandeliers spilled golden light into rooms large enough to echo, and the view of the city skyline sparkled through walls of glass. There was a private theater where premieres were screened before they even hit public cinemas, a wine cellar that stretched like a labyrinth, and gardens so meticulously groomed that strangers often mistook them for museum grounds. From the outside, the Sea Estate was the very picture of success. It was the kind of place where neighbors slowed their cars just to stare through the gates, hoping for a glimpse of what they imagined was a perfect life. But inside those gates, I learned early that beauty can be a prison dressed in silk. Every step I took echoed in halls that felt too big for one girl, halls where my voice never quite belonged. I was surrounded by every luxury yet deprived of the simplest thing I craved: warmth. Even as a child, I could feel the cold structure of my father's rules pressing in from every direction. The servants moved quietly, eyes lowered, never daring to offer a smile or a word of comfort, as if the house itself demanded silence. I remember nights when I stood at the tall windows, watching the lights of the city below, wondering if in those tiny glowing squares of life there might be families who laughed together, who hugged goodnight, who knew how to love without condition. In that house, my schedule was drawn up as carefully as the architectural plans of the towers my father built. Tutors arrived precisely at 9, piano lessons stretched into the evening, and dinner was served at 8 whether or not anyone truly wanted to sit at the long, polished table. Every detail of my day was monitored, reported, and scrutinized. There was no room for mistakes, no space for curiosity, no freedom to choose who I wanted to be. Even as a child, I felt the invisible weight of my last name pressing on me, reminding me that I wasn't Renee the little girl. I was Renee Say, the heir to an empire I had never asked to inherit. The mansion may have been filled with treasures from around the world, but none of them belonged to me. My toys were chosen for me, my clothes approved by my father's assistant. Even the books I read were carefully selected to improve my mind rather than feed my imagination. When I sneaked novels under my pillow, stories of girls who traveled oceans and discovered who they were outside their families, I felt guilty, as if dreaming was a betrayal. Slowly, I learned to hide pieces of myself, to tuck away the parts that didn't fit his vision. Looking back, I think that house taught me my first lesson about appearances. You can live surrounded by beauty and still feel empty. You can eat at a table lined with silver and still go hungry for love. You can sleep in a bed draped in silk and still wake up aching for freedom. That was the truth of my childhood. A truth that no one beyond those gates would ever believe. And at the center of that truth was my father, Charles Say, the man who had built both the empire and the cage. It was impossible to separate the house from him because every wall seemed to carry his presence, every rule traced back to his voice. To the world, he was a legend, a man who shaped the skyline. To me, he was the shadow that stretched across every corner of my life. And as I grew older, the shadow only grew darker, teaching me lessons that would scar far deeper than I ever realized at the time. My father, Charles Say, was a man who commanded every room he entered. His suits were tailored so precisely that not a thread was out of place. His voice carried the weight of authority that silenced even the boldest executives, and his reputation stretched far beyond New York. Business journals called him a visionary. Politicians sought his donations and his company at charity galas. To the outside world, he was everything a man could hope to be: brilliant, powerful, and untouchable. But behind the walls of our mansion, he was something else entirely. I saw a different side of him, one that the cameras and newspapers never captured. He had a way of turning every moment into a test, as though love was conditional and respect had to be earned through obedience. He believed that discipline was the same thing as devotion, and cruelty could be disguised as strength. I learned this the hard way through the lessons he forced on me. When I was 16, I missed curfew by less than half an hour. He drove me to a ski resort 2 hours away, handed me no money, no phone, and told me to figure out my way home. I remember scrubbing dishes in the back of a noisy restaurant just to earn enough for a bus ticket, the sting of humiliation burning deeper than the cold on my hands. At 20, I challenged him once at a dinner table when he dismissed one of my ideas for a business project. He didn't yell. He simply looked at me, stone-faced, and the next morning, every one of my credit cards was canceled. For months, I lived on scraps of savings, too proud to ask for help, too scared to admit to anyone why my life had suddenly shifted. When I confronted him, he called it a lesson in humility, as if stripping me of independence was a noble gift. Every punishment came wrapped in the same explanation: this is for your own good. But deep down, I began to wonder, was it really for my good? Or was it only about keeping me under his thumb? Each time he reminded me that respect was not given but earned, I tried harder, worked longer hours at school, pushed myself beyond exhaustion, thinking that maybe if I achieved enough, he would see me as worthy. Yet no matter what I did, the approval I craved never came. Instead, his eyes measured me with a cold calculation, as if I was never quite enough and never would be. The world knew him as a man of discipline and brilliance, but I knew him as the storm that followed me everywhere. When he walked into a room, the air grew heavier, and silence fell as though even walls bent to his authority. And I, his only daughter, learned to shrink in his presence, to speak carefully, to avoid lighting the spark of his anger. Over time, fear began to masquerade as respect, and I carried that confusion in my chest like a weight I could not put down. But the greatest wound was not in the lessons or the punishments. It was in the absence of something softer. When my mother was alive, she had been the one who stood between us, the gentle hand that could soothe his harsh words, the warmth that made the house feel less like a prison. When she died, that buffer was gone, and the full force of his control fell on me. It was then that the shadow he cast over my life grew darker than ever, and the emptiness inside our golden home became unbearable. When my mother died, the world I knew collapsed in silence. Margaret Say had been the only soft place in my life, the only voice that carried warmth instead of judgment. She was diagnosed with cancer, and within months she was gone, leaving me at 21 with a father I barely understood, and a house that suddenly felt colder than ever. I remember walking through those vast hallways after the funeral, the sound of my footsteps echoing against the marble as if the house itself had been hollowed out. Without her, there was no one left to stand between me and my father's relentless expectations. For a time, I thought grief might soften him. In those first weeks, I looked for cracks in his armor, for any sign that he too was broken by losing her. But if he felt the pain, he buried it in his work and his obsession with control. He spent longer hours at the office, demanded more from me at the company, and filled every conversation with orders rather than memories. Where I longed to talk about her, to keep her alive in stories and shared sadness, he closed the door. To him, grief was weakness, and weakness was unacceptable. Not long after, he remarried, and with that decision, my isolation deepened. His new wife brought her daughter, Veronica Hale, into our home. Veronica was only a year younger than me, but from the moment she arrived, the balance of our house shifted. She was charming, bright, and eager to please, everything my father seemed to adore. While I had spent years fighting for scraps of his approval, she received it effortlessly. He invited her to dinners, praised her ideas and conversations, and gave her the affection I had begged for my whole life. It didn't take long before I began to feel like a guest in my own house. At the dining table, the seats seemed to rearrange themselves so that Veronica sat closer to him, laughing easily while I remained quiet. In the office, when I tried to share ideas, he brushed me aside but asked for her opinion as though she had suddenly earned a place I never could. And in the rare moments when I looked for solidarity, Veronica's smile carried the unmistakable glint of rivalry. She had no interest in being my sister. She had found her way into the circle of his approval, and I had been pushed out even further into the cold. The wound of losing my mother never closed, and the presence of Veronica only pressed salt into it. She was a daily reminder that my father's love was something I would never win, not because I hadn't tried hard enough, but because he had already chosen someone else to fill the role I had spent my life chasing. Each time I walked past my mother's portrait in the hallway, I whispered silent words to her, promises that I would endure, that I wouldn't let them erase me. But with every passing day, the house that had once been hers slipped further into their hands, and I found myself clinging to memories that felt more fragile than ever. It was in those moments that the true cracks in our family began to show. The loss of my mother had not drawn us together in mourning. It had split us apart, leaving me on one side of a chasm that grew wider each year. And as Veronica's presence grew stronger in our home, so did the realization that I was not only battling my father's control, but also the quiet competition of someone who seemed destined to replace me. Even as a child, I knew what I wanted for my future. While my father dreamed of skyscrapers and boardrooms, I dreamed of courtrooms and causes that mattered. I wanted to study environmental law, to stand up for communities whose voices were drowned out by corporations like his. My mother used to smile when I spoke about it. She said my heart was too big for numbers on a ledger, that I was meant to fight for something beyond myself. But when she died, her voice went with her, and all that remained was my father's. Charles made it clear that there was no room for idealism in our family. He told me that passion was a liability, and that dreams were distractions. The sea name, he said, was built on steel and glass, on money that moved markets and towers that touched the clouds. Law was for people who followed rules. Business was for people who made them. And because I carried his blood, I had no choice. I was enrolled in finance at his alma mater, my course schedule curated without a single question about what I wanted. I worked harder than anyone else, not out of love for the subject, but out of fear that failing would prove him right. I graduated at the top of my class, holding a degree that felt like a chain rather than a triumph. The diploma bore my name, but in truth, it belonged to him. Every achievement was tainted by the knowledge that it was not mine. It was his design, his plan, his shadow stretching across every page of my life. When I returned to join the company, I told myself that maybe, just maybe, if I worked hard enough, if I proved my worth in his world, he would finally see me. But inside the glass towers that bore his signature, I felt the same suffocation I had always felt at home. My ideas were dismissed as childish, my presence tolerated rather than valued. Even when colleagues admired my dedication, his eyes never softened. Approval remained just out of reach, like a mirage that faded the closer I came. Veronica, of course, never had to try. She walked into meetings as if she belonged there, her opinions encouraged, her mistakes forgiven. I watched the pattern repeat itself. I was the dutiful daughter who carried the weight, and she was the chosen one who carried the charm. Every time my father praised her, I felt the dream I once held slipping further away, buried under the rubble of expectations I never chose. What hurt the most was not the dismissal of my career or the constant comparisons. It was the slow erosion of my voice. With each passing year, I felt myself becoming quieter, shrinking to fit into the mold he had carved for me. I no longer spoke of law or justice. I no longer admitted even to myself that I still wanted a different life. Instead, I played the role he had written, even as it hollowed me out from within. Looking back, I can see how the cracks were forming long before that night in the rain. They were there in every silent dinner, every forced smile, every dream that was silenced before it could be spoken aloud. By the time my father left me on that dark road, the rift between us had already become a canyon, one built not just on cruelty, but on years of control, silence, and a love that had been buried alongside my mother. The morning of the board meeting, I stood in front of the mirror rehearsing every line I had practiced for weeks. My suit was perfect, my notes color-coded, my slides rehearsed until I could close my eyes and see every chart. For once, I felt a flicker of confidence. This was my chance to show that I was not just the daughter who bore my father's name, but a woman capable of leading, of shaping a future that mattered. Walking into the boardroom, I held that hope tightly, as if clinging to a fragile flame. The room itself was intimidating, lined with dark mahogany and glass, a stage built for power. Around the long table sat men and women who had watched me grow up, people who remembered me as a teenager lingering at my father's side, silent and dutiful. Today, I wanted them to see someone different. As I began speaking about sustainable development, about the undeniable shift toward green-certified projects, I saw heads nodding. Janet Miller, our CFO, leaned forward with interest. Thomas Blackwell, one of the most senior members, scribbled notes. His eyes narrowed not in dismissal, but in consideration. For the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of validation. Then my father's voice cut through like ice water. He did not wait for me to finish. "That's enough, Renee," he said, his tone cool and absolute. My words faltered, hanging in the air unfinished. He leaned back, fingers steepled, and announced to the room, "This is not who we are." Carter Enterprises doesn't waste its time chasing naive trends. We build real value. We lead markets. We do not pander to them. He looked at me with that same flat stare he had used my entire life, the one that told me I had once again failed to measure up. I tried to hold my ground, reminding the board that 78% of surveyed clients were willing to pay premiums for sustainable spaces, that the market was demanding change whether we embraced it or not. But he dismissed me with a faint smile, as if I were a child speaking out of turn. "Numbers can say anything if you twist them hard enough," he replied. "What matters is experience. And experience tells me this is nonsense." His words silenced the room. For a moment, I thought the humiliation might end there, but it did not. He turned to the others, asking pointedly if anyone truly believed I was ready to understand the scope of our empire. Janet shifted uncomfortably. Thomas cleared his throat, but no one contradicted him outright. Their eyes slid toward me with something like pity, and that pity felt worse than rejection. My carefully built proposal was tabled, not because it lacked merit, but because my father had decided that his daughter did not deserve to succeed. When the meeting ended, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor felt deafening. I gathered my notes with trembling hands, avoiding the sympathetic glances that only deepened my shame. As the last of the board members filed out, my father's voice came again, low and sharp. "If you want to indulge fantasies about saving the planet, join a nonprofit. This is business, Renee. Serious business. And you still have a lot to learn." His words landed like blows, stripping away the thin armor of confidence I had dared to wear. That day in the boardroom marked something I could never unsee. It was not just rejection. It was proof that in his eyes, I would never be more than a child fumbling in a world built by men stronger than me. And yet, even through the sting of humiliation, a quiet defiance began to rise. If he would not give me a place at his table, I would have to find my own. When I stepped out of the boardroom that morning, still burning from the humiliation my father had carved into me in front of the directors, I found Veronica waiting in the hallway. She was leaning against the wall with her arms folded, her posture casual but her smile sharp. She had not been in the meeting, but the way her eyes lit up told me she already knew how badly it had gone. "Rough presentation?" she asked lightly, tilting her head as if she were genuinely curious. Her tone was sweet enough to pass as sympathy, but underneath it was the satisfaction of someone who had just watched me stumble from a safe distance. Veronica had a way of making every loss of mine feel like her personal victory. Since the day she entered our house, she had learned quickly how to slip into my father's good graces. Where I carried the weight of discipline and rules, she floated on charm and laughter. At dinner, she filled the silence with anecdotes that made him laugh, a sound I had spent years longing to hear directed at me. At company functions, he introduced her proudly, calling her insightful even when her comments were shallow. I had spent my life fighting to be noticed, and here she was, noticed without even trying. The truth was, Veronica's presence cut deeper than I wanted to admit. She was not just another competitor in the company. She was inside my home, in the very spaces where I once felt I belonged. She had taken the seat at the dining table closer to my father. The invitations to events I was once told were too important for me to attend, and now she was inching her way into the company. Despite having little education in finance, my father gave her projects, praised her ideas, and positioned her as though she were being groomed for a future I had been preparing for all my life. One evening after the failed boardroom meeting, we sat together at dinner. My father praised her for suggesting a simple community outreach initiative, calling it visionary. I nearly dropped my fork, stunned at the word he had never once used for me, even when I had spent months crafting strategies. Veronica glanced at me, her smile polite, but her eyes glinting with triumph. In that moment, I realized she knew exactly what she was doing. She did not need to defeat me directly. All she had to do was shine just enough to cast me deeper into the shadows. I tried to ignore her. to remind myself that her approval from him did not diminish my worth. But every compliment he gave her echoed in my chest like a reminder of everything he had withheld from me. I could not stop the bitterness from creeping in, nor the sense of betrayal each time I saw his hand on her shoulder in quiet encouragement. She was a guest who had become family, a rival disguised as a sister, and my father welcomed her with open arms. The rivalry between us was unspoken, but it poisoned the air in both our home and our company. Every time she smiled at me, I wondered if she was laughing at my failures behind my back. Every time he praised her, I felt the weight of his disapproval press harder against me. What began as silent resentment slowly grew into a battle I could no longer ignore. And deep inside, I knew this was not just about Veronica. She was only the mirror reflecting back the truth I feared most, that my father would never choose me. In the days that followed, I carried Veronica's smile and my father's words with me like weights I could not put down. At work, every glance from a colleague felt like pity, every silence like a confirmation that I was not enough. At home, every laugh from the dining table that did not include me was a reminder that I was losing ground in a place that should have been mine. I tried to silence the noise in my head, but it grew louder with each passing day, a constant echo of failure and fear. There were moments when I wanted to confront them both, to let my anger pour out in a storm that would finally reveal the depth of my pain. I wanted to tell my father that his lessons had broken me more than they had built me, that his approval had become the addiction I could never satisfy. I wanted to tell Veronica that no matter how charming she was, she could never erase the years I had endured under his watch. Yet every time I opened my mouth, the words died in my throat. Fear bound me. Fear of being cast aside completely. Fear of proving to him that I was weak. At night, when the house grew quiet, I found myself lying awake staring at the ceiling, my thoughts circling endlessly. I remembered the way my mother used to hold my hand and whisper that I was enough, even when my father demanded more. I wondered what she would say to me now, whether she would tell me to keep fighting or to walk away before the fight consumed me entirely. Without her, I had no compass. All I had was the gnawing conflict inside me, a battle between the part of me that longed for his recognition and the part of me that ached to be free of him. I tried to bury myself in work, hoping that perfection might finally earn me the acknowledgement I craved. I stayed late, reviewed every report 3 times, polished every word in every email until it gleamed. But no matter how flawless my efforts were, they vanished in his eyes the moment he looked at me. He had already decided what I was, and nothing I did could change it. That realization cut deeper than any harsh word, because it meant that my worth had never been mine to prove. It had always been his to deny. The more I tried to hold on, the more I felt myself slipping. Each time he praised Veronica, the fear inside me sharpened, whispering that I was replaceable, that all my sacrifices had been for nothing. Yet in the same breath, hope clung stubbornly to me, whispering that if I could just endure a little longer, maybe one day he would finally see me. That fragile hope was both my strength and my cage, binding me to a man who had no intention of setting me free. By then, I was living in 2 worlds at once. On the surface, I was the obedient daughter, silent, composed, willing to take whatever lesson he decided to deliver. But beneath that mask, a quiet fire had begun to burn. I was angry, I was tired, and I was beginning to imagine a life beyond his control. The thought terrified me, but it also gave me breath when I felt like I was drowning. I did not know it yet, but that fragile flame inside me was about to be tested in a way I could never have imagined. And the night my father left me in the rain would strip away the last of my illusions. The breaking point came on a night that still lives in my bones. My father called me into his study after dinner, his voice steady but carrying that tone I had learned to dread. He told me we were going for a drive. I followed him without protest, though my chest tightened with unease. The air between us was heavy, filled with all the words I had never spoken and all the silence he demanded from me. We drove out of the city, past the glass towers that bore his name, into the dark stretches of the suburbs where the streets grew empty and the night pressed close. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the soft patter of rain beginning on the windshield. I stared out at the blur of lights, hoping he had brought me here to finally talk, to finally see me. Instead, he began to speak in that cold, measured way of his, telling me how my behavior in the boardroom had embarrassed him, how my stubbornness was threatening the family's reputation, how my obsession with ideals proved I was not ready to shoulder responsibility. Each word struck like a lash. I gripped my hands together in my lap, fighting the urge to break down. Then he mentioned Veronica, praising her insight, her loyalty, her ability to understand what it meant to be part of his empire. Hearing her name in that moment, in that car, under the weight of his disapproval, lit something inside me that had been smoldering for years. I told him I was tired of being invisible, that I had given him everything he asked, and still it was never enough. My voice shook, but I did not stop. I told him that his lessons had not made me stronger. They had made me hollow. For the first time, I spoke to him not as his obedient daughter, but as a woman demanding to be seen. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, his jaw hardening until it looked carved from stone. Without a word, he pulled the car onto a deserted stretch of road. The rain was falling harder now, streaking down the glass like tears. He turned to me with eyes that were colder than the storm outside. "Give me your phone," he said. When I hesitated, his voice rose, sharp and unyielding. I handed it over along with my wallet, my breath catching as realization began to dawn. He opened the door, the rain rushing in, and ordered me out. I stared at him, disbelief clawing at my throat. "What are you doing?" I whispered, my words trembling in the dark. His answer was simple, final. "You need to learn respect. Walk home. Consider this a lesson." Then he shut the door, shifted into gear, and drove away, his taillights shrinking into the storm until there was nothing left but darkness. The rain drenched me instantly, soaking my hair, chilling my body, seeping into my bones. I stood frozen on that empty road, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the thunder. 12 miles from home, stripped of everything, abandoned by the man whose approval I had spent my life chasing. He thought this would break me. He thought the storm would teach me submission. But as I began to walk, each step splashing in the cold water, I felt something inside me shift. I was furious. I was shattered. But I was also awake. For the first time, I saw him clearly, not as a father, but as a man who would sacrifice his own daughter to preserve control. And in that clarity, I knew this night would not end the way he intended. This was not the lesson he planned. This was the moment my life would change forever. The rain had become relentless, each drop stinging against my skin like a reminder that I had been left behind. My clothes clung to me, heavy and cold, and my shoes filled with water until every step felt like I was sinking deeper into the earth. I tried to count the miles in my head, but the road stretched endlessly, swallowed by the night. With each passing car that never came, with each gust of wind that howled through the trees, the weight of what my father had done pressed harder on my chest. He had abandoned me, not metaphorically, not in some symbolic way, but literally left me stranded like I was nothing. I walked until my legs trembled, until my breath came in ragged gasps. My vision blurred from the rain, and at one point I stumbled to the side of the road, collapsing against the soaked grass. My body shook uncontrollably, not only from the cold, but from the heartbreak that seemed to seep into my bones. I wanted to scream, but the storm swallowed my voice. In that moment, for the first time, I felt truly invisible. The daughter of Charles Say, heir to an empire, reduced to a shivering girl no one could see. Then, just as the weight of despair threatened to drag me under, headlights appeared in the distance. At first, I thought I was imagining it. That exhaustion had begun to play tricks on me. But the lights grew closer, cutting through the rain, slowing as they approached. A black SUV pulled up beside me, its tires hissing on the wet pavement. The window rolled down and a voice called my name, steady and certain. Renee. I froze, torn between hope and fear. In that moment, trust felt like the most dangerous thing in the world. But before I could move, the door opened and a man stepped out. Tall and broad-shouldered, rain soaking into his jacket without slowing him. He moved quickly toward me, crouched down, and without hesitation draped his coat around my shoulders. The warmth was immediate, startling, as though I had been pulled from drowning back into air. His voice was low but firm. "It's all right. I've got you." For a second, I wanted to pull away, to demand who he was and why he knew my name. But the strength in his grip, the steadiness in his eyes anchored me. He guided me into the SUV, shutting the door against the storm, and only then did I find my voice. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice hoarse. He glanced at me, hands steady on the wheel as he pulled back onto the road. "My name is Ethan Ward," he said. "I've been watching over you for a long time." The word sent a chill through me, not of fear, but of disbelief. Watching over me? For how long? Why? Questions swirled in my mind, but exhaustion pinned me to the seat. For the first time that night, I felt the cold beginning to leave my body. For the first time, I was not alone. The hum of the engine filled the silence as we drove through the rain, but my mind was louder than the storm outside. I clutched the coat he had given me, still dripping at the hem, and studied the man behind the wheel. His jaw was set with quiet determination, his eyes focused on the road, yet there was a calmness about him that made it hard to look away. Finally, I found the courage to speak. "You said you've been watching over me. What does that mean?" He glanced at me briefly, then back to the road. "It means you haven't been as alone as you thought." His voice was low, even, as though he had rehearsed this moment for years. I shook my head, confusion and suspicion warring inside me. "Why? Why would a stranger follow me?" He did not hesitate. "Because your Uncle Richard asked me to." At the sound of my mother's brother's name, my breath caught. Richard Montgomery had always been a distant presence in my life, someone I saw only on holidays or in fleeting visits before he passed away 5 years ago. He had been kind, softer than my father, but I had never truly known him. The idea that he had left someone behind to protect me felt impossible, yet the certainty in Ethan's tone left no room for doubt. "I don't understand," I whispered. Ethan continued, his words careful but firm. "Before he died, Richard knew that your father's control over you would only grow stronger. He worried about what would happen if you were left without your mother's protection. So he asked me to keep an eye on you, to make sure that if the day ever came when you needed someone, you wouldn't be alone." I sat back, stunned. Memories of my uncle flickered in my mind. His quiet smiles, the way he slipped me books he knew my father would disapprove of. The times he reminded me that strength didn't always have to look like power. Tears blurred my vision as I realized he had seen what I could not admit, that he had prepared for a future where I might need saving from my own family. "Why tonight?" I asked finally, my voice breaking. "Why show yourself now?" Ethan's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. "Because tonight he crossed a line. I've seen your father push you before, but leaving you on that road in the middle of a storm, that wasn't discipline. That was cruelty. Richard told me that when the moment came, I'd know. And tonight was the moment I turned toward the window, watching the rain slide in streams against the glass. My heart a tangled knot of gratitude and disbelief. Part of me wanted to collapse into relief, to accept his presence as the safety I had longed for. Another part hesitated, afraid to trust, afraid that this too could vanish. But as exhaustion weighed down my body and the warmth of his coat pressed against my skin, I knew one thing for certain. My father had abandoned me, but my uncle had not. By the time the SUV slowed to a stop, the rain had softened to a drizzle. Ethan pulled into the driveway of a quiet townhouse on the edge of the city, a place I had never seen before. The lights inside glowed warmly against the storm, and for a fleeting second I felt like I had stepped into another world, far from the coldness of my father's mansion. Ethan helped me out of the car, his hand steady at my elbow, and guided me inside. The air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, a sharp contrast to the sterile perfection I was used to. Waiting in the living room was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an air of calm authority. She rose to greet me, extending a hand. "Renee, my name is Olivia Grant. I was your Uncle Richard's attorney, and I think it's time you learned what he left behind for you." Her grip was firm, and the seriousness in her gaze told me this was not a casual meeting. I sank into the armchair across from her, still wrapped in Ethan's coat, still trembling from the night. Olivia opened a leather folder on the table, pulling out documents neatly clipped together. She slid the first page toward me. "This," she said, "is your mother's trust. What your father never told you is that Margaret ensured her portion of the estate, as well as Richard's shares in the company, were set aside for you. Together, that makes you the controlling shareholder of Say Enterprises." The words hit me like thunder. I shook my head, staring down at the legal jargon that seemed too heavy to comprehend. "That's not possible," I whispered. Olivia's voice was steady. "It is not only possible. It is fact. Your father has concealed this from you, manipulating the company's structure to keep you out of power. But legally, you have the majority stake. You have had it for years." My chest tightened as the implications spread through me. All this time, I had been begging for scraps of approval, for a seat at a table that was already mine by right. My father had not just denied me his love. He had stolen my voice in the very empire that should have been mine to lead. The betrayal cut deeper than any punishment he had ever dealt, because it was deliberate, calculated, and hidden beneath layers of lies. Tears burned in my eyes, not of weakness, but of fury. I thought of the nights I stayed late at the office, working myself to exhaustion just to prove I was worthy. I thought of the boardroom humiliation, of Veronica's smirk, of every moment I felt small. And now, here was proof that I was not small at all. I had been kept small by design. Olivia's hand rested gently on the folder. "Renee, your uncle trusted you. He believed you had the heart to lead differently than your father. That is why he made sure you would have the power to change things when the time came." Her words wrapped around me like a promise and a burden all at once. I looked at Ethan, who stood quietly nearby, his presence solid as ever. For the first time that night, I felt the anger inside me crystallize into something sharper, something that could no longer be ignored. My father had left me in the rain to teach me humility, but what he had truly given me was the strength to face the storm of truth. I sat in that warm townhouse, staring at the papers Olivia had laid before me, my hands trembling as though the weight of the entire world had been dropped into them. Controlling shareholder. Those words felt unreal, like they belonged to someone else. Someone stronger, someone ready. For years, I had believed I was powerless in my father's world, destined only to endure his tests and live beneath his shadow. Now I was being told that I had held the power all along, hidden behind layers of lies and silence. The first feeling that struck me was anger, sharp and consuming. I thought of every humiliation, every punishment he had justified as a lesson, every time he made me believe I was less than I truly was. He had stolen more than money. He had stolen time, years of my life that I had spent chasing approval I never needed. I pressed my palms to my eyes, fighting the sting of tears, because I did not want to cry in front of Olivia or Ethan. I did not want this revelation to feel like defeat. It was supposed to be liberation. But with the anger came fear. If my father had hidden this truth so carefully, what would he do when he realized I knew? What kind of war would he wage to keep me silent? I thought of Veronica, of the way she thrived under his wing, and I knew she would fight beside him without hesitation. The idea of standing against both of them, of standing against the man who had controlled every part of my life, made my chest tighten until I could hardly breathe. Olivia must have sensed the storm inside me because she leaned forward, her tone steady but kind. Renee, power is never easy to hold, but you are not alone. Your uncle trusted me and Ethan has been here for years. You have more strength than you realize. The question is not whether you can fight this battle. The question is whether you are ready to stop letting him define who you are. Her words settled over me like a challenge. Ethan added quietly, "He left you in the rain tonight because he believed you were weak. He doesn't know you've already survived more than he can imagine. If you choose to fight, I'll be here. You won't face him alone." His voice carried no hesitation, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the weight on my shoulders begin to shift. It did not disappear, but it no longer felt unbearable. I looked down at the documents again, tracing the lines of my name printed in bold, legal clarity. This was not a dream. It was not a trick. It was my reality, waiting for me to claim it. My father had spent years teaching me to obey, to shrink, to remain in the shadows. But tonight, abandoned in the rain and rescued by the truth, I realized something I had never allowed myself to believe. I had a choice. The fear was still there, crawling at the edges of my resolve, whispering that I could lose everything if I dared to step out of line. But beneath that fear was something stronger, something that had been buried for too long. Determination. If he wanted a lesson, then I would give him one he would never forget. The night Olivia placed those documents in my hands, I realized knowledge alone would not be enough. My father had built his empire not only on power, but on fear, and fear was something he had perfected in me. If I wanted to challenge him, I would need more than the truth. I would need a plan that struck at the very foundation of his control. Sitting around Olivia's worn wooden table with Ethan at my side, I felt for the first time that I had allies who believed in me, not in the C name, but in the person I was trying to become. Olivia laid out the reality with the precision of someone who had fought battles in courtrooms her entire life. "You have the legal right, Renee," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But he will not surrender quietly. He will deny, he will intimidate, and he will try to make the board doubt you. If you want to win, you must be prepared to show them not just who he is in business, but who he is behind closed doors." Her words settled heavily on my shoulders. I had lived under his cruelty for years, but I had never thought of turning that cruelty into evidence. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes steady on mine. "3 steps," he said simply. "First, gather everything we can. Financial records, correspondence, anything that proves he concealed your ownership and misused company assets. Second, go back into that house and play his game. Pretend you are still obedient, still seeking his approval, and when he lets his guard down, record what he says. Third, take it all to the board and force the truth into the light where he can't twist it anymore. His voice carried no hesitation, and hearing it laid out so clearly filled me with a strange mix of dread and resolve. The thought of returning to my father's house after what he had done on that rainy road made my stomach twist. Yet I knew Ethan was right. To defeat him, I would have to step back into the cage, not as the frightened daughter he had trained me to be, but as someone ready to tear the bars apart from the inside. I thought of Veronica, how quickly she would leap to defend him, how eagerly she would twist the knife if she sensed my weakness. That, too, would have to be part of the plan. She was not just a rival. She was an extension of his power. We spent hours that night poring over records Olivia had already begun to collect. Each page revealed more of his deceit. Hidden accounts, transfers buried in subsidiaries, decisions signed under my name without my knowledge. Anger rose in me with each discovery, but beneath it was also fear. What if he discovered what we were doing before we were ready? What if he turned the board against me, painting me as an ungrateful child trying to dismantle the very empire that fed us all? The doubts whispered constantly, but Olivia's calm explanations and Ethan's unwavering presence anchored me. By the time the first light of dawn seeped through the curtains, the outline of the plan was clear. We would strike at him with his own weapons: truth, timing, and control. I would return to the mansion, smile when he expected silence, bow my head when he expected submission, all while recording the words that would one day betray him. It terrified me, but it also awakened something inside me that I had long buried. For the first time, I was not reacting to his lessons. I was preparing to teach him one of my own. Walking back into my father's mansion after everything felt like stepping into the lion's den, but this time I carried a secret resolve. I forced myself to move with calm, to let the familiar chill of those marble halls settle over me without breaking my composure. When he looked at me across the dining table that first night, his gaze sharp and measuring, I lowered my eyes and let him believe I was still the obedient daughter he had shaped. Inside, though, I kept Olivia's words close. His cruelty would be his undoing, but only if I allowed him to reveal it. It didn't take long. He spoke with his usual authority, reminding me of my failures, dismissing the hours I spent at the office, and warning me not to embarrass him again. I let him talk, my hands steady around the stem of my glass, while the small device hidden in my pocket recorded every word. His voice was cold and commanding, filled with the same contempt I had endured for years. But this time, each word was no longer a wound. It was evidence. Veronica, however, was harder to endure. She sensed the shift immediately, as if she could feel that I no longer carried the same desperation I once did. She poked at me in subtle ways, offering smug comments about how grateful she was for my father's trust, how she hoped one day I could earn the same. At dinner, she leaned closer to him, whispering ideas he praised with an ease that made my blood burn. When she caught my eye across the table, her smile held the same glint of rivalry I had seen so many times before. But now, instead of shrinking under it, I returned her stare with calm indifference. That unsettled her more than any words could. One evening, when my father had stepped out to take a call, Veronica cornered me in the hallway. Her voice was low but sharp as a blade. "You know you'll never beat me, right? He'll never see you the way he sees me. You should just accept it." I looked at her, the anger rising, but instead of lashing out, I let a small, controlled smile slip across my lips. "We'll see," I said simply, before walking past her. For the first time, she looked uncertain. Each day I played the role more carefully, letting him believe I had bent once again to his will while quietly gathering the proof Olivia needed. Ethan stayed close, never far from reach, and his steady presence kept me from unraveling when the weight of the act grew heavy. There were nights when I lay awake in my old room, the memories of my childhood pressing down on me, and I wondered if I was strong enough to see this through. But each recording, each document Olivia uncovered, added to the fire inside me. The house that once felt like a prison was becoming something else. A stage, and every word my father spoke, every sneer Veronica threw, was setting the scene for the confrontation that was coming. I no longer walked those halls as a captive. I walked them as someone preparing for war. The day of the board meeting arrived, and as I walked through the tall glass doors of Say Enterprises, my heart pounded with a rhythm that felt almost foreign. This was the building I had grown up around, the empire I had been told would never truly be mine. And yet today, I carried the truth in my hands. Olivia's files were tucked into my bag, Ethan close by, though invisible to the boardroom, and within me the quiet determination that had been forged in the storm. The directors gathered one by one, their voices low, their eyes flicking between me and my father. Charles sat at the head of the table as he always had, composed and commanding, his presence filling the room like an unshakable shadow. Veronica sat beside him, poised with a smile that told me she believed this would be the day I finally shattered. I took my seat without looking at either of them, keeping my focus on the thick folder in front of me. The meeting began with routine reports, but I hardly heard them. My moment came when my father dismissed the floor, clearly eager to move past any business that might give me ground. I stood, my voice steady though my pulse raced. I have something to present. His eyes narrowed, irritation flashing, but I pressed on, sliding the first document across the table. These records, I said, my words measured, show financial transfers hidden in subsidiaries. Funds that were siphoned from my mother's trust, funds that were never reported. Gasps rippled through the room as directors leaned forward, studying the evidence. Charles laughed, a sharp, cold sound. Baseless accusations, fabricated numbers. She doesn't understand what she's talking about. But Olivia, seated near the back, rose with her credentials in hand. These are not fabrications, she said calmly. I was Richard Montgomery's attorney, and I can verify the authenticity of these documents. The weight of her words silenced the murmurs. I met my father's glare, my voice gaining strength. And this, I continued, pressing a small recorder on the table, is him admitting exactly how he treats his own daughter. The room filled with the sound of his voice, cruel and unyielding, ordering me out of the car on that stormy night, calling it a lesson. The silence that followed was deafening. Every director's face carried shock, some with disbelief, others with anger. Charles shot to his feet, his composure cracking, his hand slamming against the table. How dare you bring this filth into my boardroom? He thundered, his face red with fury. Veronica jumped up beside him, her voice shrill as she accused me of betrayal, of fabricating evidence to tear the family apart. But the more they shouted, the clearer the truth became. The mask they had worn for so long was gone, replaced by rage and desperation for everyone to see. For once, I did not shrink. I stood tall, letting their fury burn itself out, letting the board witness the man behind the empire. The silence that followed was no longer mine to endure. It was his. And in that silence, I knew the tide had finally turned. The silence that followed my father's outburst hung in the air like smoke after a fire. The director sat frozen, their eyes darting between him, Veronica, and me. For years, they had witnessed his temper in glimpses, but never stripped bare like this, never with evidence echoing through the speakers for all to hear. My father stood there, chest heaving, his authority crumbling in the very room he had ruled unchallenged. Veronica's protests only sharpened the picture, her voice shrill and desperate, clinging to a power that was slipping through their hands. Olivia stepped forward, her calm presence a sharp contrast to their chaos. She laid additional documents on the table, pointing to signatures, dates, and clauses that confirmed my majority ownership. By law, she said firmly, Renee Say holds controlling interest in this company. Everything you have seen today proves not only misconduct, but deliberate deception. This board has the right and obligation to act. The directors whispered among themselves, their expressions shifting from confusion to certainty. Thomas Blackwell, the senior member who had always carried himself with quiet dignity, cleared his throat. I believe we've seen enough. A vote must be taken. His words cut through the room with the authority my father once commanded. And in that moment, I realized the tide had turned completely. My father's eyes burned into me, fury and betrayal twisting his face. You think you've won? He hissed, his voice low but sharp enough for me to hear. You'll destroy everything I built. I met his gaze without flinching, the years of fear finally falling away. No, I answered, my voice steady. I'll build something different. The vote was swift. One by one, hands raised against him. Even those who had once bowed to his power now turned away, unwilling to tether themselves to a man exposed by his own cruelty. When the final count was read, the verdict was clear. Charles C. was suspended from his role, stripped of authority, his empire no longer his to command. He stormed out of the boardroom, Veronica trailing after him with a face pale and furious, her eyes shooting daggers at me. But their fury no longer mattered. For the first time in my life, I felt the weight of his shadow lift. The silence that remained was not heavy anymore. It was liberating. Thomas turned to me, his expression softening. The company is yours, Renee. What happens next will define us all. The words landed on me like both a gift and a burden. My hands trembled slightly as I gathered the documents, not from fear, but from the enormity of what had just shifted. I was no longer the girl begging for a seat at the table. I was the one leading it. Walking out of that boardroom, Ethan fell into step beside me, his quiet strength grounding me. For a moment, I let myself breathe, let the reality sink in. My father had left me in the rain to teach me humility, but in the end, it was his downfall that became the lesson. Not for me, but for him. And as the doors closed behind us, I knew this was only the beginning of what I was meant to build. News of the board's decision spread faster than I expected. By the next morning, headlines filled the business pages, each one carrying the same shocking truth. Charles C. had been suspended from his own empire. The name that once commanded respect now carried a shadow of scandal. For decades, he had been the man who built skylines, who turned empty lots into towers of glass and steel. Now he was the man who had hidden assets, manipulated trust funds, and abandoned his own daughter in a storm. His reputation, once untouchable, was unraveling thread by thread. At home, the change was immediate. The mansion that had always echoed with his authority grew quiet, the staff moving with uncertainty, unsure of whom to obey. My father locked himself away in his study for hours, and when he emerged, his face carried the weight of a man cornered. He did not speak to me, but his silence was not the silence of power anymore. It was the silence of a man who had lost control. Each time our eyes met, I saw something I had never seen before. Not anger, not dominance, but fear. Veronica reacted differently. The girl who had thrived in his shadow, who had basked in his approval, now looked at me with open hatred. She accused me of betrayal, of tearing the family apart, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and desperation. Without his power to back her, her words felt hollow, but I could see the sting of her fall. The invitations to company events stopped arriving. The directors who once humored her no longer took her calls, and the easy praise she had grown used to disappeared overnight. She was left with nothing but resentment, and she directed every ounce of it toward me. I thought their downfall would feel sweeter, that I would revel in watching them stripped of the power they had used to keep me small. And for a brief moment, I did feel satisfaction, a sense of justice finally served. But as the days passed, I realized that victory carried its own weight. My father paced the halls of the mansion like a restless ghost, and sometimes I caught him staring at the windows, as if searching for the empire he had lost outside those glass panes. Veronica's bitterness poisoned every room she entered, her whispers sharp enough to cut, though they no longer had the power to wound me. What lingered most was not triumph, but the strange ache of seeing them diminished. My father was no longer the towering figure I had feared my entire life. He was a man broken by the truth, a man who had gambled with lies and lost. And Veronica, who had believed she could replace me, now stood exposed as nothing more than his accomplice. Their empire had crumbled not because I destroyed it, but because it had been built on foundations that were never meant to last. Standing in the silence of that house, I finally understood. Power without trust is fragile, and control without love is doomed to collapse. My father had thought he was teaching me lessons. In the end, it was his own downfall that became the greatest lesson of all. Taking the seat at the head of the boardroom table for the first time felt nothing like victory. The polished wood stretched endlessly in front of me, the same table where I had once been silenced, humiliated, and dismissed. Now every eye in the room turned to me not as the daughter of Charles Say, but as the new leader of Say Enterprises. Their gazes carried a mixture of curiosity, caution, and expectation. Some were hopeful, others skeptical, but all of them were waiting to see if I was strong enough to carry the weight that had crushed my father. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the folder before me, but I steadied them on the surface of the table. I thought of my mother, of her belief in me, and of Richard's trust when he set aside the shares that had brought me here. I reminded myself that I was not here to become the version of my father they were used to. I was here to be something different. The first weeks were the hardest. Every decision I made was scrutinized, every directive questioned. I walked into meetings where doubt lingered in the air, colleagues whispering that I lacked experience, that I was too young, that perhaps I had only inherited my position through scandal. I felt the sting of their doubts, but I refused to let them see it. Instead, I stayed longer hours, studied harder, and asked questions without shame. Slowly, piece by piece, I began to earn their respect, not through fear, but through persistence. I focused on the vision I had once presented, the one my father had ridiculed as naive. Green developments, community engagement, transparency. I built a team willing to take risks on ideas that would not only profit us, but also give us purpose. When the first project under my leadership broke ground, a sustainable office space designed with both innovation and people in mind, I stood on the site and felt something I had never felt before. Pride. Not the fleeting pride of pleasing someone else, but the steady kind that came from doing what I believed in. Of course, challenges never stopped coming. There were moments when I doubted myself, when I wondered if I was ready to lead something this vast. I remembered the sneers of Veronica, the sharp sting of my father's voice telling me I would never be enough, and the doubts threatened to return. But then I thought of the storm, of the night he left me on that road. I remembered how I had walked through the rain with nothing and survived. If I could endure that, I could endure this. Bit by bit, the board began to see me not as a shadow of Charles, but as Renee Say in my own right. And with every small victory, with every project that succeeded, I began to believe it myself. Leadership was not about control. It was about vision, trust, and the courage to stand in the storm and keep moving forward. After weeks of long meetings, endless documents, and the constant pressure of proving myself, I finally allowed one evening to be quiet. I left the office later than usual, the city glowing beneath me as the elevator descended, and instead of driving straight back to the townhouse where I had been staying, I found myself steering toward the cemetery where my mother was buried. It had been years since I visited alone, and the thought of facing her stone after everything made my chest ache, but something inside me told me I needed to be there. The night air was cool and still, the storm from weeks ago now only a memory. I walked the gravel path slowly, the sound of my footsteps the only noise in the silence. When I reached her grave, I lowered myself onto the damp grass, folding my hands in my lap. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at her name etched into the marble, my throat tightening with all the words I had swallowed for years. "Mom," I whispered, the word breaking as it left me. "I wish you were here. I wish you could see what's happened." My voice wavered, but once the first words came, the rest poured out. I told her about the boardroom, about the documents Olivia had shown me, about how my father had finally been stripped of his power. I told her about Veronica's betrayal and the hatred that now colored every glance between us. And then, more quietly, I told her about my fear. Fear that I wasn't strong enough. Fear that one wrong step could undo everything. But as I spoke, something shifted inside me. The memory of her voice came back to me. The way she used to tell me that strength didn't always mean being the loudest in the room, that sometimes the greatest courage was simply refusing to give up. Sitting there in the stillness, I realized that in every step I had taken, I had already carried her strength with me. She had been gone for years, but she had never really left. Tears slid down my cheeks as I leaned closer, pressing my fingers against the cold stone. "I'm going to make this company different," I said softly. "I'm going to make it something you'd be proud of. Not just towers of glass, but something that matters." The promise felt heavy but right, like a thread tying me back to her, anchoring me in the storm of everything I had endured. When I finally stood, the ache in my chest had not disappeared, but it no longer felt unbearable. There was peace in knowing I had spoken the words I needed to say. Peace in knowing she would have believed in me even when I could not believe in myself. Walking back to the car, I felt lighter, steadier, more certain of the path ahead. For the first time in years, the silence around me did not feel empty. It felt like a quiet kind of love. In the days after visiting my mother's grave, something inside me shifted. I returned to the office with a steadiness I had not felt before, as though the weight of the past no longer pressed me down but instead grounded me. The fear that once lingered at the edges of every decision began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence. I knew the battles ahead would not be easy. My father was not a man who would vanish quietly into defeat, and Veronica's bitterness was far from spent. Yet for the first time, I was no longer defined by their shadows. I spent long hours in the office shaping a new vision for C Enterprises. Meetings that once filled me with dread now felt like opportunities. I listened to the voices my father had silenced, the junior associates with fresh ideas, the employees who had always feared speaking up. Their trust in me grew slowly, like dawn breaking after a long night. And with it came the realization that leadership did not have to mirror the iron fist I had endured. It could be something softer, steadier, and still unshakably strong. One evening, as I stood by the window of my office overlooking the skyline my father had built, I caught my own reflection in the glass. For years, I had seen a girl trying desperately to be enough. Now I saw a woman who had walked through storms and survived, who had turned humiliation into strength and betrayal into resolve. The city lights stretched endlessly before me, and instead of feeling small, I felt infinite. Ethan remained close, always watchful, though he never imposed. His presence was a reminder that I was no longer fighting alone, and that trust, once broken, could be rebuilt in unexpected places. Olivia continued to guide me, her counsel sharp and unwavering, but she too gave me space to make my own choices. Their support mattered, but the most important shift was within me. I no longer needed my father's approval. I no longer craved Veronica's validation. The only voice that truly mattered was my own. Still, I knew the story was not finished. My father's empire had been wounded, but he was a man who thrived on control. I could feel his silence gathering like a storm on the horizon, and a part of me wondered when and how he would strike again. Yet, unlike before, the thought did not terrify me. Instead, it steadied me. I was no longer the girl abandoned on a rainy road, shivering and invisible. I was the woman who had risen from that storm stronger than he could have ever imagined. As I turned away from the window that night, I felt the future stretching out before me, uncertain but alive with possibility. Whatever battles lay ahead, I was ready. My father had once tried to teach me lessons through cruelty, but in the end, I had learned my own. That sometimes the greatest revenge is not destruction, but transformation. And in that truth, I found peace. Looking back now, I see how every moment was shaping me into the woman I was meant to become. My father thought he was teaching me discipline, but all he taught me was how cruelty can never replace love. Veronica thought she could replace me, but in truth, she only reminded me that no one can take away what is rightfully yours when you finally find the courage to claim it. The real lesson came not from their betrayals, but from what I discovered in myself. I learned that power is not about control, but about trust. Strength is not about fear, but about resilience. And sometimes the greatest revenge is not in tearing others down, but in standing tall and building something greater than they ever believed you could. If there is one thing I want anyone listening to my story to remember, it is this. You are never as powerless as the people who hurt you want you to believe. Even when you are left in the storm with nothing, you can rise, you can endure, and you can choose to write a different ending for yourself. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If my story touched you, if it reminded you of your own strength, I hope you'll like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear that they too can survive their storm. This is not just my story. It's a reminder that sometimes the final revenge is living free, living strong, and never looking back.